Sacrifice and Sanctuary. Written by Just Thinking Drabbles. Read by Arashi. When the battle had ended, Hubert felt the full extent of his exhaustion wash over him. It was present in the aching of his body, the burning in his eyes, and, perhaps most concerning to him, the sting of magic on his hands after pushing himself far past his limits. He hadn't meant to. Truly, he hadn't. But despite the pain, he felt he did not regret it. After all, it was his duty to protect Her Majesty and the other members of the strike force, and he had long accepted the fact that sometimes that meant sacrificing himself for the sake of achieving said protection. But even as he trudged through the camp, with as passive and neutral an expression as possible, he couldn't ignore the crackle of residual magic still burning on his fingertips. It was a reminder of his mortality, and the fact that if he wasn't careful, then at any moment he could be swept away by the hand of his enemies or his own carelessness pertaining to the spells he wielded. Everyone knew that dark magic was a costly thing to deal in, and when one used too much, the price was all the more weighty. He had taken much to procure their victory in battle, and now the magic was simply taking from him what it was owed. Once safely within the privacy of his tent, he sat on the edge of his bed with a sigh, and carefully removed his dirty gloves to get a better look at his hands. As he had suspected, the strains of dark magic had grown, now running down past the edge of his palm, and trickling into dark, ugly lines down his wrist. He closed his eyes, and took another deep breath to try to calm down. The power he possessed was immeasurable, and though he was grateful for it, that didn't mean that he didn't resent it a little for what it had done to his hands. They were not beautiful. They never would be again. They were cracked and scarred, and stained an ugly gray color, which would frighten anyone who so much as gazed at them. And he wouldn't blame them either. Luckily, he had been careful not to allow such an embarrassment to come to pass. Hubert kept his gloves on at all times, and when one pair got dirty or destroyed, due to the more gory parts that came with being the imperial spymaster, he was always sure to have an extra pair with him. It was easier that way, and for his sake, as well as everyone else's, he had learned to hide them, and hide them well, as with most things in his life. But such deceptions could not last forever, and this particular one ended with the quiet flap of his tent opening and the familiar clanking of armor as someone stepped inside. He knew who it was before even looking, since it was he who had been the one to request the visit. He just hadn't expected him to come so soon, but Ferdinand von Eyre was nothing if not punctual. Hubert turned with wide eyes to meet his gaze, and immediately began to search for signs of contempt and disgust within his expression. This was the first time even Ferdinand had seen him without his gloves, and perhaps it was unfair to expect a terrible reaction when he knew that in reality the man he loved would never treat him that way. And he didn't either. Far from it, in fact. He gave him the softest smile, one no less charming or bright than any other he gifted, and took a seat beside Hubert on the bed. Neither of them spoke for a moment, and it felt almost as if Ferdinand was giving him the opportunity to put back on his gloves if he wanted to. He respected him and his emotions, and knew if there was something he wanted to share, then he would do so when he was ready. Perhaps it was because he understood him so well that it made Hubert decide not to hide them away again. He wasn't sure if he would ever really be ready to share the darker parts of his life with him, but he wanted to nonetheless, and he knew he wanted the same too. "May I?" Ferdinand asked, as he held out his hand. Hubert hesitated for only a second, before nodding and placing his hand in his. He watched intently as his hand was turned over, and gasped as his lips gently pressed against his wrist. They had lingered there for a long time, and he was sure that Ferdinand could hear the quickening of his pulse as he did. He felt undeserving of such love, and yet he could not bring himself to pull away. When the kiss finally ended, Ferdinand wrapped both his hands tightly against his own, and his warm palms thawed his icy skin. "They're beautiful," he whispered. He leaned forward and pressed their noses together. Then spoke again, softer this time, and Hubert almost didn't hear him through the blood pumping in his ears. "You're beautiful." Beautiful. The word felt foreign to Hubert's ears, and he did not know if he would ever get used to hearing him say that. Unsure of how to respond, he wrapped his arms around him instead, and buried his face into his neck. He hoped that it might hide the tears forming in his eyes, and if Ferdinand noticed, he said nothing about it, as he embraced him tightly in return. They stayed like that for a long while afterwards, content in the comfort that being with one another brought, and allowing the rest of the world to fade, as they held each other close.